series of welcome remarks in my function as the local host. It's a big pleasure to host this conference, which I would say is in the spirit of European collaboration and the need to make the results of research accessible to a broader audience. And so we are really happy that we also have a distinguished guests who were ready to participate in today's event. Before I pass on to Christine Wahlhöft, I just have a few technical announcements to make. The first one is that the conference will be videotaped and photographed. So if anyone from the audience does not want to be photographed or filmed, there are various ways what you can do. One is to raise your hands and ask Sebastian Schröder and Thomas Feek, who do the taping, to keep your face in mind. This might be hard on their memories. An easier solution is that you just go to the gallery, les chercheurs du paradis. So if you go up there, you are certain that you can listen and watch everything we do and say here, but you will not be on tape. So you just have to go up the staircase and go up there. Everybody received a conference booklet with an evaluation form and a postcard with reference to the Global Brain Health Survey. And there is a Dropbox for the evaluation forms at the registration desk, and we kindly ask you, if you feel like it, to fill it out and drop it. The name tags are important. Please wear them for the duration of the conference because they serve as identification for the Western staff of the Hanak House. And again, if you don't forget, drop the name tags at the registration desk at the end of the conference. The coffee breaks will be held in the Planck lobby and the Einstein lounge. The Planck lobby is right next to this place. The Einstein lounge is downstairs. And this also gives me the opportunity to say that this was actually the guest house of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society before the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, for various reasons, ended to exist with the end of the Second World War. And after that, perhaps some of you may not know this, this was the Offizierscasino, basically the clubhouse of the US Allied Forces. So I actually grew up in this city district, and sometimes when I went to school, I saw tall guys coming out of this building with lots of badges, very impressive. And then after German unification, the US military was kind enough to hand this over back to the German state, who then, if you wish, went back to the original designation, and then it became the guest house of the Max Planck Society. And you can find some bits and pieces of the history, this is why I'm saying this, in the Planck lobby. Lunch will be served in the same rooms. There is a Twitter account for this event, and also if you want Wi-Fi access, you just have it on the wall there. And before I hand over to Christine, there's one item that is really dear to my heart. I would like to thank Helena Maravilla, who is in my staff on the Berlin side, and Barbara Friedman on the Oslo side, who currently is on maternity leave and then was replaced by Marie Arnesen. The two of them were a fantastic team. For me, this was basically a hands-off event. I basically could step in here this morning, and it was all fine. And they just have done a fantastic job, and there were also others involved, like Lorraine Krüger, Jürgen Rosbach from our graphics department, and Thomas Feek and Sebastian Schröder. So I just want to mention these names right at the beginning of the event because it was a true pleasure to work with them. And with this, I pass on to Christine.
Thank you very much. So welcome all also from me. So I represent the Lifebrain consortium, and we're a European consortium spanning now 12 partners and 7 countries, and we are integrating data on cognitive and brain function across the lifespan from 11 studies. And a central part of Lifebrain is to engage across all people who can have an interest in brain research. And that's not only scientists, but also clinicians and patients and lay people, everyone basically. So first of all, I'd really like to thank you all for coming here. I think that's great. I would also, of course, like to thank our Lifebrain host, Ulman Lindenberger, and the Max Planck Institute for Human Development for arranging this, and of course, the German Brain Council. I can mention that the European Brain Councils have been very important to us in Lifebrain in making such conferences and events and helping us get engagement for this science, which is extremely important. So I'm very grateful for that. And so in this, here with us, we also have our sister consortium, the Silver Santé study, which is on mental training techniques. So I would like them also to thank them also for joining us here, and it has been very fruitful and exciting so far. And today we have with us some of really the top speakers in their fields, so I really look forward to listening to them. And I don't want to say too much more now before handing over to Alfons Schnitzler from the German Brain Council, but there is one technical note. We would really like to have a photo of all the consortium members who are still here from the Silver Santé and the Lifebrain study, along with all the speakers of today, right? And in order to do this, it's really great if before lunch you guys do not leave the room. I know some of you were in this yesterday, but if we can just, line up at the stage and in front of it, then we'll do this, and it will be really good to have, okay? So by this, I would like to hand over to Alfons Schnitzler from the, I would like to hand over to the sister consortium. So, Olga,
it's okay, we can also switch, but if we want to stick to the program. So a warm welcome also from me on behalf of the Silver Santé study. We are also a European consortium in Horizon 2020. Our aim is to study the impact of mental training techniques such as meditation, health education, or language learning on healthy aging, and we have 3 different studies. One is a cross-sectional study on experts, and 2 are longitudinal studies where we test the impact on training basically over time, either 2 months training or 18 months training. This study is spearheaded by Gaël Chetela, and we also extend a warm welcome to you here. It's nice that so many people came, and we look forward to the talks by the distinguished guest speakers. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the people on each of these teams who helped. So for Medit-Aging, I would like to thank Charlotte Reed, Rhonda Smith, and Gaël Chetela. And on behalf of Medit-Aging, I would also like to thank people on the Lifebrain side. So I had the pleasure of meeting them during our preparatory phone calls and Skype calls. So Isabelle Liosne, Andreas Brandmeier, Sandra Duzel, Marie Ernsten, Barbara Bodorkos-Friedman, Christian Dreven, Rebecca Carver, and Helena Maravilla, who did an excellent job here. So a warm welcome to you, and I look forward to our discussions.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alfons Schnitzler. I'm representing the German Brain Council, which has actually been founded last year, beginning of last year, and is an umbrella organization of 14 scientific associations who deal with study of brains, and 4 patient organizations. All in all, we represent more than 60,000 individual members, and it's really a great pleasure for the German Brain Council to be part of this wonderful conference, and I have to thank all the people who have really done the work. We were just invited to participate, and it's a great pleasure because one of the major missions of the German Brain Council is really to promote health and to try to convince the stakeholders to do everything to foster research in promoting brain health in Europe. And I think this is something that we have all in common. I'm looking forward to the conference and to the talks. Thank you very much. Now I hand over to the session chair. The first session chair was Klaus Ebbmeyer.
Hi, I'm stepping in for Klaus Ebbmeyer this morning. So I would like to welcome you all today. Thank you for coming. And our first speaker is going to be Ulman Lindenberger. So he's the director of Center for Lifespan Psychology at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. And he's also the co-director of the Max Planck University College London Center for Computational Psychiatry and of Aging and Research in London and Berlin. And he will tell us about a lifespan perspective on cognitive aging. So please welcome him.
Great. We are even running ahead of schedule, which of course makes my life as speaker easier. I will start with 3 references that structure most of my talk, and would also like to take this opportunity to note that when you go to the last reference, Nyberg in Lindenberger 2020, where Christine Wahlhöft and Martin Löften also have a chapter on plasticity, you will notice that in contrast to the earlier editions of this handbook, what's called the developmental section for the first time is a lifespan section. So the developmental section of this handbook always has been restricted to childhood, and it is now for the first time that the developmental section takes a lifespan perspective, which I think really is a sign that the field is changing towards a perspective that is very much also in the spirit of the Lifebrain consortium that tries to look at lifespan in the sense that it should encompass the entire everything from gestation to old age. Perhaps even probabilities about whether you are born in the first place or not. So I will start with a note on individual differences in general, just something that I would like to tell everybody, given that you are all here. And then I will report 3 pieces of empirical evidence that are relatively new. In fact, the last one is not yet published. So the rationale of developmental psychology and developmental cognitive neuroscience is the description, explanation, and modification, if we also think of the Medit-Aging consortium, of within-person changes in behavior and of between-person differences and commonalities of within-person changes in behavior across the lifespan. Now, this is a very old definition. It's from 1777. But if you take it seriously, you will find out that it's still a very, very difficult task, because we have to observe people over time, and we have to observe the way in which they change differently across time. So it is a hard task to do. We think of this such that we say that behavior is in the middle. It basically mediates what is going on at the brain level on the one hand, and what is going on in the cultural and physical environment on the other hand. And when you look at this reciprocal relationship, you can think of it in terms of long-term changes, like what is called here lifespan changes on the x-axis, or momentary fluctuations, both relative to behavior, but also relative to the brain in terms of function, anatomy, and chemistry. And I think one of the big puzzles is to relate these 2 timescales, to understand how short-term changes, for instance, an intervention, can feed into long-term changes. And again, that's a challenge that I think we are still struggling with. Another part of this puzzle is that we may know too little about the cultural and physical environment. So we often focus on behavior and we focus on the brain, and we know less about the affordance structures of the environment and how they shape behavior in the brain long term. Now, one source of individual differences are gene-environment correlations, and I just would like to highlight this source because I think it's terribly important. We know that dizygotic twins grow less and less similar to each other as they age. We also know that monozygotic twins remain highly similar to each other as they age. And as a function of these two, heritability, that means the genetic contribution to individual differences, for instance, in cognition, goes up with age, because the monozygotics stay similar, the dizygotics don't. Now, how can this be? Well, one way to think of it is that people are not randomly assigned to lifestyles. People rather seem to search for lifestyles that correspond to their dispositions, and because monozygotic twins are more similar to each other than dizygotic twins, they tend to reinforce their similarity by making similar life choices. So whenever we say things such as longitudinal studies suggest that leading an intellectually challenging, physically active, and socially engaged life might mitigate losses and consolidate gains, we should be aware of this may, because we really do not know what would happen if people would be randomly assigned to different lifestyles. And I think we need to go beyond the dichotomy of causation versus reverse causation to dynamic models of emergent individuality to really understand what's going on. And of course, running interventions with longitudinal panels and then feeding them back into the longitudinal panel is a fantastic way of tackling this problem. So I think it's very important that we have these large-scale studies and that we then draw people from these large-scale studies, do an intervention with them, because then we really have experimental control, and then put them back in the wild and see how they develop over long term. So, and I just wanted to bring you, this is a citation from a German philosopher of the Enlightenment, 1777, and this is my translation of him. But as soon as one has to look at the individual circumstances of people in the world and in society, everything is full of difficulties. If the natural dispositions of people were all alike, then the contexts in which one individual is developed most perfectly would be the most appropriate for all. But this conclusion is, like the premise, opposed to experience. Just truth, without which philanthropy turns into a fusion, requires that inequality is valued just as highly as equality. This was in 1777, and it's a fantastic treasure trove for lifespan psychologists. Okay, I now come to my first piece of empirical data, with this correlated cognitive change in adulthood. So we know from various studies that we do find aging-related declines in cognitive abilities. These are data from Tucker, Drope, and Salthouse. But what we do not know, based on cross-sectional data, is whether these changes are actually correlated across abilities. Because if we look at cross-sectional data, we have the mean age trend, and the mean age trend introduces a covariance that might not mean that those who lose a lot in one ability, or those who maintain one ability very well, are the same people as those who lose another ability or maintain another ability. So in order to know something about the dimensionality of cognitive change, we actually have to use longitudinal data and look at the covariance of change. And only then do we get an answer to the question, does it all go together when it goes, or does it tend to stay all together when it stays? This is what we did in this study led by Tucker Drope and with the participation of Andreas Bandmeier. So we looked at the literature and collected estimates of shared variation in normal range longitudinal changes in two or more different cognitive abilities using contemporary methods for modeling change. That means latent growth curve or latent difference score modeling. So we only looked at data sets that were corrected for measurement error. And this is just an animation of some of the studies that we sampled. This resulted in 89 effect sizes representing shared variance in cognitive changes, such as, let's say, the correlation in change in perceptual speed with the, let's say, verbal knowledge. From 22 unique data sets, and we had something like over 30,000 unique individuals. The final meta-analytic data set had longitudinal waves ranging from 2 to 12, that means 2 measurement occasions up to 12 measurement occasions. Various longitudinal time lags, average age as baseline varied from 35 to 85, and we had a whole host of measures to look at that are listed here. then we ran so-called multi-level meta-regression models that account for the nesting of effect size with samples. So you should, of course, take into account whether a given effect size of a correlation comes from the same study or from a different study. And we also did what's called effective error-based precision weighting, which accounts for time lag, number of waves, and magnitude of variability and change, which all contribute to the precision of the estimates. And this was very much work of Andreas Brandmeier. And there was additional downweighting to account for the number of effect sizes contributed per study. So we try to set it up in a way that we get unbiased, efficient estimates of the covariance of change. Here, I'm not showing you the change, I'm showing you the levels. So this is what's typically called the G factor. How highly do the different cognitive abilities hang together? And you can see that about 59% of the variance in cognitive abilities is shared. That is, they load on a common factor. They express something like common variance or general intelligence or general cognitive ability. But this is the levels. This is people at a given point in time. Now comes the interesting question, what is with the changes? Do the changes hang together? Oh, and this is just the model for the levels. So here you can see we have a general factor of intelligence, and the various abilities load on it highly and pretty homogeneously. What about shared variance and age-related changes? It's the same. An average of 60% of individual differences in longitudinal changes are shared across different cognitive abilities. That is, the change is just as G-like as the levels. And when you look at the meta-analytic factor model, you can see that the various abilities all load highly, moderately to highly on this common factor of change. Now you can ask yourself, is this perhaps just a byproduct of correlations between the slopes and the levels? If initial level is highly correlated to change, then the change-change correlations must just be a byproduct of that correlation. However, this is not the case. Here you see the level-slope correlation, and it's close to zero. That is, it is not the case that those who start out high lose less. We don't see that. The correlation is about zero. What we do see is that those tests that are good indicators of the general level are also those that tend to be good indicators of the general slope. So how good a measure indicates common change is predicted by how well it predicts common level. This is what you see here. So the next question could be, so imagine we now have this common change. Things change in concert. Now imagine this going on over time. If it goes on over time, then the changes should become more and more correlated as people age. This is what we call dynamic dedifferentiation. So the common factor of change should actually increase with advancing age. And this is actually what we see. So here you see the slope commonality, that is how much of the change is shared across the different abilities. And there you see mean baseline age. And you can see that as people age, their change becomes more and more G-like. The changes of the various cognitive abilities behave more and more in concert. And when we control this for people who later, based on some indicator, might become demented, then the results hold. So this is not an artifact of the admixture of likely dementia cases in the sample. This is something that we can see in what's commonly referred to as a normal range of functioning. So the conclusions is there is a substantial general dimension of cognitive aging, accounting for an average of 60% of individual differences in longitudinal cognitive declines. And this general dimension strengthens with age. Now this has important implications for science, because it means that it's worthwhile looking for mechanisms that act on the aging brain in a rather domain general manner. And now, as an aside, what are the implications of this finding for the theory of fluid versus crystallized intelligence? So this is a theory that many of you might have seen. And it says that there are the aging vulnerable abilities, and they decline with age, and then there are the aging resilient abilities, such as verbal knowledge, and they just stay there, they just stay constant. However, note that verbal knowledge participates in the general factor of change just as much as any of the other abilities. Just as much. So what does that mean? It means that there are people who show less decline in what's typically referred to as the mechanics of intelligence or fluid intelligence, such as processing speed, working memory, reasoning, and so on. And those who show less decline in these abilities actually show gains in crystallized intelligence. And those who show more losses in these abilities actually also lose in knowledge. So the intelligence machinery is moving in a G-like fashion through age, not in a way that replicates this dichotomy. And now, is this good news or bad news? I would say it is news that makes it very worthwhile to look at what you may call brain maintenance, or what may maintain brain integrity in a relatively general fashion. And I will come back to this at the end of my presentation. Okay, I now come to another meta-analysis, and that analysis is on education. Because there has been a long-standing hypothesis in the literature that years of education attenuate cognitive decline, that those who have higher education show less cognitive decline. This has been something that has been around for a while, and Martin Löfven and others were asked for psychology in the public interest to actually look at what the evidence is. And just to be clear about terms, when I here speak of education, what I refer to is formal, full-time education, typically accumulated contiguously during childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, prior to long-term entry into the labor market. That means Bildungsjahre in the sense of what you accumulate like in the first third of your life. And it's typically measured either in terms of educational attainment, that means the highest certificate that a person gets, or years of education. And we did this review for both measures, and the results are the same. So whenever I now say education in the next 7 minutes, I refer to this kind of education that happens more towards the first third of life. And there are two influential propositions, as I already said. The first one is more education is associated with higher cognitive abilities in early adulthood. And the second is that more education is associated with less aging-associated cognitive decline. And these are two different ideas. And just to give you a sense that this is something that also is interesting from a historical perspective, here you see the secular changes in years of schooling over historical time. So schooling has come up. That's a short summary of this. Okay, I just give you the results right away. Education is positively associated with levels of cognitive functioning. And I should again say that this is based on meta-analyses of of all the available evidence up to this point. So one additional year of education is associated with roughly 0.4 to 0.8 standard deviations of higher cognitive performance. So that means that 5 additional years of education correspond roughly to 3 to 6 IQ points. And this association is actually quite robust and replicable. Now, of course, not all of this effect is causal in the sense that education has produced it, because there is a lot of self-selection going on in education. People, again, as I told you at the beginning, are not randomly assigned to educational careers. But some of it is likely to be causal, and I will get to one piece of evidence in a minute. So level of cognition is positively associated to education. However, we didn't find any evidence that education is substantially related to rates of change. So the question of whether having more education makes you age more slowly. The meta-analytic effect sizes are either not different from 0, or they are very small and inconsistent and actually go in both directions. This is a slide that I wanted to show you for effects that might be interpreted as being causal. because these are the rare cases where a country has changed its education regime and has extended mandatory schooling by 1 additional year. And then you can really make relatively well-controlled analyses and ask the question, how much more cognitive performance do I get with 1 additional year of education? And you can see that the effect sizes tend to be reliably different from 0. This is just to show you one of the meta-analytic findings, I think in this case for episodic memory, and you see the effect sizes here, and they are nicely distributed around 0. So this is asking the question whether more education is associated with less cognitive change. And there's simply no evidence to suggest that. Now comes a very important point. That, of course, does not mean that higher levels of education are unimportant for cognitive outcomes in old age. It's just the opposite. Education is enormously important for cognitive outcomes in old age. Because if you think of 2 people who start out with higher levels in early adulthood, and some of these differences can be attributed to education, and then they go on the same path through adulthood, they of course will reach the level that then will qualify them for a dementia diagnosis at different points in time. So just having these 2 parallel curves and looking at them as a function of age will make you realize that a person who starts out lower is more likely to hit a threshold at an earlier age than a person who starts out higher. What you can also see from this graph, and I should say that this is of course a caricature because I now really boosted the difference in level here. What it also means is that a person with high education will hit the threshold at a point in time where his or her decline is already more pronounced than the person with less education. Yeah? All this is just a function of parallel slopes and a constant threshold. You do not need differential rates of change to get to this picture. And I think that does have implications for theories of cognitive aging. I would say that given that education boosts cognitive levels in early adulthood but does not attenuate cognitive decline, it is unlikely to build a cognitive reserve. So I don't think that Jakob Stern is right when he says that education acts as a cognitive reserve in the sense of attenuating cognitive decline. If one uses that meaning of cognitive reserve, I think it's not accurate. And it is also unlikely to foster brain maintenance, because if it were to foster brain maintenance, then those who have higher education should show lower rates of cognitive decline if brain translates to behavior, which we somehow all believe. Now, of course, there are things that do foster brain maintenance, and I think we will hear more about them today. We also have done work on this, and I think, yes, there is something to it, but that's a different talk. Okay, so now I come to this issue of brain maintenance and to the last part of my presentation. And it's my pleasure to present some preliminary findings from BASE 2. BASE 2 is also part of the Lifebrain consortium, and this is very much in spirit of the work done at the Lifebrain consortium. And I think I have shown the slides by now 100 times. It is from the Betula data and is meant to show that some people tend to stay high in old age. So high performance, age group, these are not longitudinal data, but you still can imagine what is it that allowed these people to show little cognitive decline. And various mechanisms have been proposed for that. I just mentioned plasticity, compensation, reserve, maintenance, and I cannot go through all of them. All I can say at this point is in order to really separate them, you would need longitudinal evidence and intervention work. And I'm now going to present you only correlational work, cross-sectional work, so this has, what I'm going to show you now has to be taken with a grain of salt. Instead, I would like to focus on one mechanism, namely maintenance, that Lars Nyberg and I and others have worked on a lot in recent years. So it's a very simple proposition. it says that some people show a relative lack of senescent brain changes in age-related brain pathology. So whenever you have samples of older adults that are large enough, you will find some who brain-wise look pretty similar to young adults. And we think that this is a sign of preservation of neural resources, which of course entails ongoing repair. So perhaps they have better repair mechanisms that allow them to stay at a higher metabolic equilibrium. And we think that these individual differences in aging-related brain changes allow some people to show little or no age-related cognitive decline. So the assumption simply is that those who have maintained brain integrity, if you wish, are those people who then should also show better cognitive performance. And of course, the question is maintenance a general or a specific thing? And I think there are some indications for generality, such as the couple changes that I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. But there are also some indications of specificity. I mean, we do know that the brain is a modular organ and that not all things work in the same way and change with age in the same way. So there also should be areas where we can look at brain maintenance and related cognitive functioning in a more specific manner rather than in a G-like manner. And one area of performance that in the past and still we are particularly interested in is the relationship between brain maintenance and memory aging, which of course brings us to a brain area that I think we will hear more about in the course of today, namely the hippocampus. So then the question is it the case that maintenance of hippocampal structure and function is associated with better episodic memory performance? And just to show you some background that this might be a meaningful proposition, Naftali Raz, who also is with us today, and I and others, we have looked at longitudinal changes in hippocampal volume, and we do find individual differences in change in hippocampal volume, and we also do find that the individual differences in change are associated with hypertension and cardiovascular risk. So there's something to look at. And there also is an analysis by Tanja Gorbach and others, I think she's also here today, from the Betula data that shows that change in episodic memory and change in the hippocampus, that means individual differences in hippocampal shrinkage, are related over time. So that gives us some reasons to believe that there indeed might be a link. And this brings me to a study that is led by Ilva Kühnke from the BASE2 group, and it had two aims. First is to explore the feasibility of a latent factor approach to multimodal brain imaging, and second, to test hypothesized associations between region of interest of what we call brain integrity factors and the latent factor of episodic memory. So I just run you through the measures. We have a behavioral sample of 1,500 people with 4 episodic memory tasks, and we have a magnetic resonance imaging subsample of 341 people, age range 61 to 82, and the data were acquired on a 3 Tesla scanner. And again, these are cross-sectional data. They need to be followed up by longitudinal measurements. We had 3 measures of structural imaging, namely the magnetization transfer ratio, mean diffusivity, and gray matter probabilities. So gray matter probabilities are basically the volume of the hippocampus. Magnetization transformation, I just see Emma in the room, is something that we have inherited from Magdeburg. It depends on water content, concentration, and chemistry of macromolecules, and our interpretation is that a higher ratio means denser tissue. And then we have mean diffusivity of the diffusion tensor, which typically is used to image white matter, but we use it to image gray matter. And here, again, the idea is that if a water molecule can move less well around, the tissue might be denser, okay? And this is just some sample descriptives. This is not really important. This shows you the selectivity of the imaging sample relative to the total sample. And so you can see that the imaging sample is pretty much similar to the total sample. These are our regions of interest: precuneus, prefrontal cortex, parahippocampal gyrus, and the hippocampus. And these are kind of the usual suspects when you think of individual differences in memory performance. And this is the model. So here you have prefrontal cortex. We have collapsed it about orbital and dorsolateral. Here's the hippocampus, here's the parahippocampal gyrus, and here's the precuneus. And for each of these, we have the magnetization transfer, we have the mean diffusivity, and we have the volume-based and voxel-based morphometry. These are the methods factors that basically, this is a volume method factor, a magnetization transfer method factor, and a mean diffusivity method factor. They are kind of nuisance factors. We are not interested in them. Yeah? What we are interested in are these guys, because these guys, we think, express the integrity of the brain region. Beautifully, you can see that individual differences in these integrity factors are correlated. So we now get kind of a G brain integrity thing as we had a intelligence G before. So that's, I think, is promising. Also, if you look later, it changes. Now, how does age relate to these integrity factors? It does, and this is a small, relatively small age range, but nevertheless we find age relations. How does episodic memory relate to them? Positively to all four, and you see the largest relation for the hippocampus. I rushed you through this, but I hope you can see these numbers. These are the important numbers, and these are the statistical tests associated with them. So far, I did this only with the MR sample, but when you use full information maximum likelihood, you can just plug in the total sample. Doesn't matter, because the model just takes the data it has. So this is now for the 1500. And you again find the same associations, except that now the association to the precuneus is gone. Controlling for age, only the hippocampus and the parahippocampal gyrus survive, and controlling, kind of throwing age, sex, education, and systolic blood pressure at it, the correlation that survives is the one between episodic memory and the hippocampus. So the summary is a multi-method, multi-trait approach, because this is what this does. Filtering out the method variance in order to get at the integrity factors seems to be a viable way of representing regional individual differences in brain integrity. And the latent brain factors show the predicted associations among each other in line with the notion of general maintenance to age, but also to episodic memory, in particular to the hippocampus. And also as a methodological aside, you can use these methods in a situation where you have only a subsample of individuals with MR data and a larger behavioral sample they are a part of. Then you can then this is perfectly fine to have everybody in the model. Yeah, and I think that this is a promising approach. Of course, there's one big question. What the hell does this factor of integrity mean biologically? And I think there we just need to do more work in order to know what causes the tissue to be less dense and denser. I have a provolone here and the mozzarella here. I assume if we had done this experiment with the mozzarella and the provolone, we would have gotten a similar integrity factor. So clearly we need to do some biological work to understand what's going on. This brings me to the last slide. The unanswered question is, what exactly is maintained and how? And perhaps we can go into this in the general discussion. I won't go into it now. I would like to thank all these people. I could thank even more, but these were really the people who did a lot of the work of the data that I showed you today. And I just want to mention that Elliot Tucker-Drobe got the Alexander von Humboldt Max Planck Research Medal yesterday. So here you see him next to Martin Stratmann, the president of the Max Planck Society, and Herrn Pape from the Humboldt Foundation. And it was a great pleasure to be at yesterday's event, which is why I was late for dinner, for which I again apologize. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this talk. Now I would like to introduce Gail Schittler, who's the director of research at INSERM and the head of the multimodal neuroimaging and lifestyle in aging and dementia research team. Her research looks into the mechanisms underlying aging, dementia, and lifestyle factors that can delay or prevent illness. And in her talk, she will tell us if and how meditation can improve well-being in an aging population. Once we have